Picture this. It's the winter of 1941, the cold of the Russian east bites like a wolf, and inside a Panzer IV, a young 22-year-old German sergeant grips the controls, sweating despite the -30 degrees Celsius -22 degrees Fahrenheit freezing his breath. The engine roars, but the tank skids in the snow, while a Soviet T-34 emerges from the fog like a ghost, its 76mm gun pointed straight at its turret. One shot, a deafening roar, and the world reduces to smoke, fire, and the screams of comrades trapped in a burning sardine tin. Welcome to Why German Tank Crews Suffered So Much on the Eastern Front, a journey into the heart of Operation Barbarossa, where Hitler's dream of conquering the Soviet Union became a mechanical and human nightmare for the men of the Panzer divisions. The Eastern Front, from June 1941 to May 1945, was the most brutal theater of World War II, a vast battlefield that stretched from the gates of Moscow to the outskirts of Berlin, claiming more than 30 million lives on both sides. The German invasion, with 3 million soldiers and 3,000 tanks, promised a swift victory, but instead turned into a quagmire of mud, snow, and Soviet counterattacks. The tank crews, the elite of the Wehrmacht, faced not only the Red Army, but an invisible enemy: the Russian winter, treacherous terrain, and a Soviet production that flooded the front with superior T-34s. Of the 20,000 German tanks sent east, more than 80% were destroyed, and their crews, some 100,000 men, suffered mortality rates of 60 to 70%, burned alive, or captured in massacres. This book unravels why these armored warriors, proud of their blitzkrieg, ended up suffering so much on a front that devoured them. Operation Barbarossa, launched on June 22, 1941, was the largest attack in history, with 3 army groups sweeping toward Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev. Panzer divisions with tanks like the Panzer III and IV were the vanguard, advancing 300 kilometers in weeks, encircling and annihilating Soviet armies. But initial success hid the storm. The Soviets, outnumbered and outgunned, responded with massive production: 80,000 T-34 and KV-1 tanks, designed with sloped armor and powerful guns that pierced German steel like paper. The Panzer crews, trained for mobile warfare, found themselves in an unequal duel, where a single T-34 could destroy 3 Panzer IIIs. The terrain, boundless steppes, swampy rivers, dense forests, made every advance an odyssey, and the winter of 1941, with temperatures of -40 degrees Celsius, froze engines and men alike. The suffering of the crews was not only physical, it was a siege of the soul. Inside a Panzer, 5 men, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator, operated in a 3 cubic meter space, with temperatures ranging from 50 degrees Celsius in the summer to freezing in the winter. The smoke from gunfire was suffocating, the noise of the engines deafening, and a bullet piercing the armor could ignite ammunition, turning the tank into a death trap. Captured, they faced summary execution or Soviet gulags, where 60% died of hunger or exposure. Their diaries, preserved in archives, speak of fatigue, fear, and a longing for home, written by candlelight on nights of alert. This book explores their daily battles, from ambushes at Kursk to desperate retreats at Stalingrad, revealing how a front that devoured entire armies chewed up its crews with particular cruelty. Nazi propaganda painted Panzer divisions as invincible, with posters of roaring tigers and slogans of quick victory. Young men recruited in 1940, many from the Hitler Youth, enlisted with dreams of glory, but the Eastern Front brutally awakened them. At Smolensk in 1941, crews lost tanks at rates of 50 per day, exhausted by constant repairs in track-swallowing mud. Fuel rationing, compounded by partisan sabotage, left stranded tanks, easy targets for Soviet Il-2 fighters. The crews, often without replacements, fought with chronic fatigue, their bodies marked by burns and shrapnel scars. This analysis unpacks how Soviet numerical superiority, combined with German logistical errors, turned these warriors into victims of their own ambition. The Russian winter was a silent killer, more lethal than any cannon. In December 1941, before Moscow, Panzer crews shivered in tanks without adequate heating, with frozen lubricants seizing engines. The Soviets, adapted to the cold, counterattacked with T-34s equipped with air filters that worked in snow. Thousands of Germans died of hypothermia, their bodies stiffened next to abandoned tanks. Crews, forced to dig their vehicles out of the ice, lost fingers and ears to frostbite. This book details how the climate, ignored by planners in Berlin, transformed the war of movement into a struggle for survival, where the cold killed more than bullets. Soviet tank superiority was a decisive factor. The T-34, with its 76mm gun and sloped armor, was faster and tougher than the Panzer IV, which struggled to penetrate it at ranges greater than 500 meters. At Prokhorovka in 1943, during the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank collision in history, 6,000 vehicles collided, with German crews outnumbered 5-1. The Soviets, with unlimited production, were replacing losses. The Germans, with bombed-out factories, were not. Trapped in turrets, the crews faced fiery infernos when a Soviet shot landed, 70% of them dying in their tanks. Testimonies from veterans like Otto Carius describe the panic of seeing dozens of T-34s emerging from the smoke, an unstoppable wall of steel. The terrain of the Eastern Front was a deadly labyrinth. The steppes of Ukraine allowed rapid advances, but the swamps of Belarus swallowed entire tanks, leaving crews stranded under artillery fire. In Stalingrad, urban ruins turned every street into an ambush, with Soviet tanks lurking from basements. Partisans, armed with mines and bazookas, attacked supply convoys, leaving crews without fuel or ammunition. This book examines how the vast territory, larger than Western Europe, stretched German lines, exposing crews to isolation and counterattacks, where a tank was nothing more than a rolling coffin. The psychological toll was immense. Panzer crews, proud of their elite role, faced a mind-shattering toll. The fatigue of driving around the clock, repairing under fire, and burying comrades created a cycle of exhaustion. Many developed tank fever, an irrational fear of being burned alive. Captured, they suffered Soviet atrocities, including mass executions as at Kharkov. Their memoirs, published after the war, reveal a pride tinged with trauma, a legacy of men who fought for a regime that betrayed them. This analysis honors their humanity beyond ideology, showing how the Eastern Front transformed them into survivors of a mechanical hell. As we close this introduction, prepare for a deep journey into the Eastern Front, where German tank crews fought not only the Red Army, but a multifaceted enemy: the weather, the terrain, and Soviet numerical superiority. Using veteran accounts, archival data, and tactical analysis, this book reveals why they suffered so much, a tribute to their courage on a front that devoured dreams and lives. If military history fascinates you or you seek to understand the cost of war, subscribe and hit the bell. Would you survive as a Panzer crewman in the Russian winter? Share in the comments. Now, let's dive into Chapter 1, the birth of the Panzer divisions and Barbarossa's dream. Chapter 1, the Eastern Ice Front. The Eastern Front, which began with Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, was a colossus of brutality, and the Russian winter proved a relentless adversary for German tank crews. The Panzer III and IV tanks, designed for the roads of Western Europe, were unsuitable for the frozen steppes and swamps of the Soviet Union. In December 1941, temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, freezing the tank's fuel and oil and leaving crews stranded in an endless white landscape. Men, wrapped in inadequate overcoats, suffered from hypothermia while attempting to repair engines in blizzards. Of the initial 3,000 German tanks, more than half were disabled by the weather before the end of the year. Winter didn't just halt the German advance, it decimated the men powering it, turning their tanks into cold coffins. The Russian terrain was as formidable an enemy as the Red Army. In autumn, Rasputitsa, the seasonal mud, turned roads into quagmires, trapping panzers up to their tracks in mud. A single tank could require hours of work to free, with exhausted crews digging under enemy fire. In winter, deep snow and ice caused tracks to slip, while frozen rivers fooled drivers who saw their tanks sinking as the ice broke. At Smolensk in 1941, panzer divisions lost hundreds of vehicles in swamps, leaving men open to ambushes. The terrain offered no respite, and every kilometer advanced was a Pyrrhic victory, paid for in sweat, blood, and wrecked machines. The Panzer crews, trained for blitzkrieg, were unprepared for the Russian winter. Their uniforms, designed for short campaigns, offered little protection against the Arctic chill. Soldiers improvised, wrapping themselves in stolen blankets or newspapers, but frostbite was common, with fingers and feet lost to gangrene. On the outskirts of Moscow in 1941, thousands of Germans died of hypothermia, their stiff bodies found next to immobile tanks. Rations, scarce due to collapsed supply lines, left men starving, burning calories to stay warm. The cold didn't just kill, it sapped morale, turning the proud Panzertruppen into shadows of their former selves. The tanks themselves were victims of the climate. The Panzer IV's diesel engines needed heaters to start in -30 degrees Celsius -22 degrees Fahrenheit, but the German team lacked them. Lubricants solidified, tracks seized, and optical sights clouded with ice. In contrast, Soviet T-34s, with retrofitted air filters, operated in the cold, giving the enemy an advantage. German crews spent hours warming engines with improvised fires, risking detection. At Stalingrad in 1942, tanks trapped in snow were easy targets for Soviet artillery. German technology, praised in Poland, became a liability in Russia, betraying its crews. Winter amplified German logistical vulnerability. Supply lines stretching 1,000 kilometers from Berlin collapsed under the weather and partisan attacks. Fuel, critical for the panzers, arrived in dribs and drabs, leaving tanks stranded in the middle of combat. In December 1941, the 2nd Panzer Division was immobilized near Moscow due to a lack of gasoline, its crews abandoning vehicles under fire. Spare parts were rare, forcing mechanics to cannibalize damaged tanks. Men without food or shelter slept inside their tanks, shivering as the cold seeped through the steel. The Russian winter transformed mobile warfare into a static struggle, decimating crews. The enemy exploited the weather as a weapon. The Soviets, accustomed to winter, used skis and sleds to ambush panzer columns. During the Moscow counteroffensive in December 1941, T-34s attacked from the snow, surprising the exhausted Germans. The crews, trapped in damaged tanks, were easy prey for snipers. Partisans, operating in frozen forests, laid mines that destroyed tracks, rendering the tanks useless. In a single month, the Germans lost 1,200 tanks to ambushes and weather, with crews dying in the retreat. Winter didn't just slow the Wehrmacht, it made it a vulnerable target. The crew's morale crumbled in the cold. Soldiers, trained for swift victories, faced an endless war in a hostile landscape. Letters home, found in archives, speak of desperation. A 19-year-old gunner wrote of the fear of never waking up after falling asleep in the snow. Camaraderie, vital to survival, was strained by hunger and exhaustion. Officers, under pressure from Berlin, demanded impossible advances, eroding the men's confidence. At Kursk in 1943, crews faced days without sleep, knowing the next attack could be their last. The Russian winter didn't just kill bodies, it broke spirits. The impact of the climate was more than physical, it was strategic. The Wehrmacht planned Barbarossa for 6 weeks, ignoring the winter. This arrogance proved costly. In 1941, Army Group Center lost 50% of its tanks to the cold before reaching Moscow. The men, lacking adequate clothing, improvised with captured Soviet overcoats, but this was not enough. Overwhelmed field hospitals could not treat mass frostbite. On a single December day, 14,000 Germans were evacuated with weather-related injuries. The crews, trapped in unheated tanks, faced a war where the natural enemy was as lethal as the human one. Russian partisans compounded the nightmare. Operating in small groups, they attacked supply convoys, leaving crews without fuel or food. In Belarus in 1942, partisans destroyed 300 tanks with improvised mines, forcing the crews to abandon their vehicles. The men, isolated in the snow, were hunted like prey. Veterans' accounts describe the terror of hearing explosions in the night, knowing a mined road awaited. The partisans, invisible in the winter, turned the front into a maze of traps, where every move was a mortal risk. The cold also affected panzer tactics. Blitzkrieg, based on speed, crumbled in the snow. Tanks, designed for roads, could not maneuver on icy terrain. At Stalingrad, the Panzer VI Tigers, though powerful, became bogged down in icy streets, making easy targets for snipers. The crews, forced to fight on foot, were slaughtered by the enemy. In 1942, the 6th Panzer Division lost 60% of its tanks to weather and combat, with crews dying in desperate retreats. Winter dictated the war, nullifying the German advantage. The collapsed logistics were a fatal blow. Supply trains, blocked by snow, could not deliver parts or fuel. In Kharkov in 1942, crews repaired tanks with improvised tools, in temperatures that froze the metal. The lack of spare parts forced the abandonment of functional panzers, leaving the men vulnerable. The data is clear. In the winter of 1941-42, Germany lost 1,500 tanks to cold-related mechanical failures. The crews, without support, faced the war alone, their fate sealed by a logistical system that could not sustain them. The physical suffering was unbearable. Frostbite attacked hands and feet, leaving men limping as they operated levers. Rations, reduced to 1,000 calories a day, did not sustain the crew in the cold. In a diary of a panzer driver, he describes eating snow to stave off hunger, knowing it could make him sick. The uninsulated tanks were torture chambers, with steel walls that absorbed the cold. In 1941, 20% of German casualties were from weather-related injuries, not combat injuries. Trapped in this hell, the crews struggled to stay alive before facing the enemy. Winter also affected communications. Radios, essential for coordinating panzer divisions, failed in the cold, with batteries that quickly drained. In the Battle of Moscow, crews lost contact with their commanders, becoming isolated in the snow. Radio operators, working in tight spaces, suffered cramps and frostbite while trying to repair equipment. Orders from Berlin, demanding impossible advances, arrived in fragments, leaving the men disoriented. This isolation turned the tanks into islands of steel, surrounded by an enemy that knew the terrain. The Soviets exploited winter masterfully. Their troops, equipped with quilted coats and felt boots, moved easily in the snow. The T-34s, with wide tracks, navigated terrain where the panzers got stuck. In the December 1941 counteroffensive, the Soviets surrounded the panzer divisions, killing thousands of trapped crew members. The German crews, inexperienced in winter warfare, were tactically outmatched. Veterans remember the panic of seeing T-34s emerging from blizzards, their guns ready to fire. The Russian winter was the Red Army's perfect ally. Morale plummeted under these conditions. The men, trained for quick victories, faced constant defeats. In a 1942 report, a panzer officer describes his crew crying from exhaustion after days without sleep. The camaraderie, though strong, fractured under the pressure of cold and defeat. Suicides, though rare, increased in the winter, with soldiers unable to endure any more. The crews, watching tanks burning in the snow, knew their fate could be similar. Winter didn't just freeze bodies, it froze hope. The strategic impact of winter was devastating. The Wehrmacht, designed for short campaigns, did not anticipate a 3-year war in Russia. By 1942, 70% of Army Group South's tanks were disabled by the weather. Crews, forced to fight with damaged equipment, were massacred in ambushes. Data shows that Germany lost 2,000 tanks in the winter of 1941-42, with 10,000 crew members killed or wounded. The cold not only halted the invasion, it marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's ambitions. The human suffering was visceral. The men, without adequate clothing, used rags to cover themselves, but the cold penetrated everything. In one gunner's diary, he describes how his hands bled when he touched the frozen metal of his barrel. Infections, common due to poor hygiene, killed as much as bullets. At Stalingrad, crews lived in tanks surrounded by snow, without food or hope. The Russian winter was an enemy that did not negotiate, and the crews were its most vulnerable victims. Camaraderie offered a fragile comfort. Inside the tanks, men shared cigarettes and memories of home, trying to forget the cold. At night, they huddled together for warmth, whispering stories to keep themselves sane. But every loss, a driver burned alive, A commander killed by a sniper was a blow. Crews, bonded like brothers, found their bonds broken by the winter. In one account, a gunner describes burying his best friend in the snow, knowing he could be next. The Russian winter redefined warfare. What began as a triumphant invasion became a fight for survival. The Panzer crews, symbols of the Blitzkrieg, were reduced to exhausted groups, fighting against an enemy that used the weather as a weapon. In 1941, 30% of German casualties were from the cold, not from combat. This chapter shows how winter, more than any general, held the Wehrmacht back, leaving the crews as martyrs of an impossible war. Chapter 2. Locked in a steel coffin. The interior of a German tank, whether a Panzer III, IV, or the dreaded Tiger, was a steel coffin where the crews lived in a mechanical hell. With just 3 cubic meters for 5 men, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator, the space was so cramped they could barely move. In summer, temperatures inside reached 50 degrees Celsius, with the heat of the engine and the sun scorching the armor. In winter, the steel absorbed the Russian chill, dropping to minus 20 degrees Celsius, freezing hands and feet. The noise was deafening. The engine roared, the gun rumbled, and the tracks squealed, leaving men shouting orders into faulty intercoms. Gunfire smoke and the smell of diesel permeated the air, suffocating their lungs. Every mission was a test of endurance, with death lurking not only from the enemy, but from the tank itself. Claustrophobia was constant. The men, squeezed into their seats, could neither stretch nor rest. The commander, in the turret, looked through a narrow sight, his vision limited to a world of dust and smoke. The gunner, hunched over the barrel, suffered cramps from hours of aiming. The loader, handling 20-kilogram shells, worked in a space where a sudden movement could knock him against the metal. The driver, operating heavy levers, sweated in the heat of the engine, while the radio operator struggled with equipment that failed under vibrations. In a Tiger, larger but equally oppressive, the extra space was filled with ammunition, increasing the risk of explosion. The crews lived in a world where every inch was a danger. The Russian summer heat was torture. In 1942, during the advance toward Stalingrad, crews endured internal temperatures that melted the cable insulation. Sweat soaked their uniforms and dehydration was common, with water rations limited to 1 liter per day. The tanks, painted dark gray, absorbed the sun, becoming ovens. At Kursk in 1943, men described the metal of the turrets as untouchable, burning skin on contact. Water bottles, stored near the engines, boiled, and food, hard bread, canned meat, rotted in the heat. Crews, on the verge of collapse, continued operating, knowing that stopping meant death. The winter was even crueler. In 1941, near Moscow, the steel walls of the Panzers froze, and the men shivered without adequate heating. Gloves, if present, wore out quickly, leaving hands exposed to the icy metal. In one diary, a driver describes how his fingers would stick to the steering wheel, tearing off skin as they moved. Crews improvised burners for warmth, but the risk of fire was constant. At Stalingrad, men slept inside the tanks, huddled together to conserve heat, but the cold was penetrating. Freezing killed thousands, with 15% of German casualties in 1941-42 attributed to the climate. The tank, their home, was also their prison. The noise inside a tank was a constant assault. The diesel engine, roaring at 3,000 RPM, made it impossible to speak without shouting. Gunfire, like the 75 mm of the Panzer IV, left ears ringing, and external explosions shook the hull like a drum. Intercoms, essential for coordination, often failed, leaving the crew isolated. In one account, a gunner describes how the noise haunted him in his dreams, an echo that never ceased. Partial deafness was common after months at the front, and men developed an improvised sign language. The tank was a war machine, but its noise was a weapon against its own occupants. The risk of fire was ever present. A hit from AT-34 or a mine could pierce the armor, igniting fuel or ammunition. At Kursk, 60% of the destroyed German tanks burned, trapping the crews. The fire spread in seconds, with narrow exits making escape difficult. The burns, described in medical reports, were horrendous, with men surviving only to face fatal infections. On a Panzer IV, the ammunition stored in the turret was a time bomb, exploding at the slightest impact. The crews, aware of this, lived in constant fear of becoming human torches. The confined space amplified the danger. An armor-piercing shell, even without setting the tank on fire, sent steel fragments, secondary shrapnel, reflecting inside, shattering bodies. On a Tiger, the thicker armor offered protection, but a direct hit was still lethal. Shrapnel wounds were common, with 40% of Panzer casualties attributed to internal fragments. Men trapped in their positions could not avoid the danger. One loader, in one account, describes how a fragment tore off his finger as he loaded a shell. The tank, designed for war, was an internal enemy for its crew. Lack of hygiene was another burden. On days-long missions, crews couldn't leave the tank, urinating in bottles and defecating in cans. The smell of sweat, diesel, and excrement was unbearable, and skin infections proliferated. In the summer, the heat fostered bacteria. In the winter, the cold prevented cleanliness. A 1942 report describes crews with lice and sores, weakened by filth. Food, often moldy, was stored alongside oily tools, and contaminated water caused dysentery. Life in the tank was a battle against the body itself, with each day eroding health. Camaraderie was the only refuge. The 5 men in a Panzer became like brothers, sharing cigarettes and jokes to ease the tension. At night, they told stories of home, their voices drowned out by the roar of the engine. But the loss of a comrade, burned, mangled, or captured, was devastating. In one diary, a commander describes the silence after losing his gunner, his best friend, in an ambush. The crew, bonded by adversity, faced each mission knowing it could be their last. This brotherhood, though strong, could not protect them from the steel that encased them. Maintenance was a nightmare. The Panzers required constant repairs, but at the front, tools and spare parts were scarce. By 1942, 50% of German tanks were out of service due to mechanical failure. The crews, trained as improvised mechanics, worked under fire, dismantling tracks or changing filters in the snow. One driver describes repairing an engine with wire, shivering under shelling. Every repair was a risk, with snipers and artillery lurking. The tank, their weapon, was also their burden, demanding an effort that exhausted body and mind. The isolation inside the tank was total. Narrow sights limited vision to a world of smoke and explosions. The commander, the only one with a periscope, was the eyes of the team, but his vision was partial. At Kursk, crews described the claustrophobia of fighting without knowing if a T-34 was 50 meters away. Radios, prone to failure, left the tanks alone, without contact with other units. This isolation turned each mission into a test of faith, with the men relying on their instincts to survive. The tank was their world, but a world that betrayed them. The physical stress was relentless. Driving a Panzer required strength to handle heavy levers, often for 20 hours straight. Loaders, lifting 15 to 20 kilo shells, suffered back injuries. In one account, a loader describes fainting from exertion in the Stalingrad heat. The gunner, hunched over his sights, developed incapacitating cramps. The commander, constantly giving orders, would lose his voice after days of shouting. The human body was not designed for this punishment, and the crews aged prematurely, their bodies broken by the steel surrounding them. Death inside a tank was brutal. A direct hit could ignite the fuel, burning men in seconds. At Kursk, 70% of Panzer casualties were from internal fires or explosions. The narrow, heavy hatches made escape difficult, trapping men in the fire. Survivors, severely burned, faced infection without adequate medical care. A 1943 report describes a crewman rescued with 80% of his body burned, dying days later. Death wasn't just a possibility, it was a constant presence, lurking on every mission. The design of German tanks amplified the suffering. The Panzer IV, with only 50 millimeters of frontal armor, was vulnerable to T-34s. The Tiger, although more durable, was slow and prone to mechanical failure. By 1943, 60% of Tigers were out of service due to breakdowns. Crews, aware of these weaknesses, lived in fear of an impact. The armor, although protective, trapped internal fragments, turning the interior into a death trap. The men, trained to trust their machine, felt betrayed by it. The daily routine was a cycle of exhaustion. Crews awoke at dawn, checking engines under enemy fire. Meals, if available, were eaten in the tank, with dust and oil contaminating the food. Sleep, interrupted by alerts, was a luxury. In one diary, a radio operator describes sleeping 2 hours on 3 days, hallucinating from fatigue. The missions, often improvised by desperate orders, forced the men to fight without respite. The tank, their home, was a prison that consumed them day after day. The psychological impact was profound. Claustrophobia, combined with a fear of burning, created a tank fever that affected many. At Stalingrad, men described nightmares of being trapped in burning tanks. The pressure of operating under fire, with the enemy invisible, broke minds. A 1942 report noted that 10% of crews showed signs of mental collapse. Camaraderie, though vital, could not stem the strain. Men, seeing friends die, either hardened or broke, trapped in a cycle of terror. The tank was a paradox, a powerful weapon, but a death trap. Its armor offered protection, but also enclosed men in a space where death was intimate. At Kursk, a single day saw 400 German tanks destroyed, with thousands of crew members dead. The crews, aware of their vulnerability, carried on, driven by duty. Their stories, preserved in diaries, show a pride mixed with despair. The tank was their strength, but also their grave, a symbol of their suffering. The camaraderie inside the tank was a beacon in the darkness. The men, sharing a tiny space, became like a family. In one account, a commander describes singing Bavarian songs with his crew to calm their nerves before a battle. But every loss, a gunner ripped apart by shrapnel, a driver burned, was a blow to the heart. The crews, bonded by danger, bore the scars of their lost comrades. This brotherhood, though strong, could not protect them from the steel that encased them. Physical and mental suffering was inseparable from the tank. Shrapnel wounds, common in 50% of casualties, left men maimed. Burns, even in survivors, required months of recovery. In a field hospital in 1942, a doctor describes crew members with faces unrecognizable from the fire. Life in the tank, with its noise, heat, and cold, destroyed bodies and minds. The crews, trapped in the steel coffin, were victims of a war that consumed them from within and without. The legacy of these crews is their resilience. Despite the hell, they operated their tanks, facing the enemy in impossible conditions. In 1943, the Panzer divisions lost 6,000 tanks, with 20,000 crew members killed or wounded. Their sacrifices, though in vain for the Nazi victory, demonstrate human tenacity. This chapter honors their struggle, trapped in a steel coffin that was both their weapon and their prison, on an unforgiving front. Chapter 3: The Soviet Enemy. The Soviet enemy was a relentless force that turned the Eastern Front into a slaughterhouse for Panzer crews. The T-34, with its sloped armor and 76mm gun, was superior to the Panzer III and IV, piercing their steel at 1,000 meters while withstanding hits. In 1941, the Soviet Union produced 6,000 T-34s. In 1943, 15,000, outnumbering German production 5-1. Outnumbered German crews faced waves of Soviet tanks emerging from forests and fog. At Kursk in 1943, the largest tank battle in history, 3,000 T-34s collided with 2,000 Panzers, with the Germans losing 400 tanks in one day. The Red Army, with millions of soldiers, absorbed losses that Germany could not match. The crews, caught in this storm of steel, fought against an enemy that seemed infinite. The T-34 was a technical nightmare. Its sloped 45mm armor deflected German shells, while its gun could destroy a Panzer IV with a single shot. Its simple design allowed for quick repairs, and its wide tracks navigated mud and snow where Panzers bogged down. At Smolensk in 1941, German crews reported panic at watching T-34s sustain multiple hits without stopping. The Germans, with 50mm guns on their Panzer IIIs, needed to get dangerously close to penetrate Soviet armor. By 1942, 80% of Panzer losses were to T-34s. The crews, aware of their disadvantage, lived in constant fear of a superior enemy in every engagement. Soviet production was overwhelming. While Germany struggled with bombed-out factories, the Soviet Union shifted its industries east, producing 80,000 tanks during the war. In 1943, for every Panzer built, the Soviets produced 5 T-34s. German crews, often with damaged tanks or without spare parts, faced waves of fresh T-34s. At Stalingrad, Panzer divisions, reduced to 20% of their strength, were surrounded by reinforced Soviet armies. The data is clear. In 1942, Germany lost 2,500 tanks to direct combat with T-34s. The outnumbered crews felt like hunters facing a stampede. The Red Army didn't rely solely on tanks. Its infantry and artillery were devastating. 57mm anti-tank guns, hidden in trenches, could pierce a panzer at 500 meters. At Kursk, Soviet artillery created fields of fire that destroyed tanks before they even saw the enemy. Soldiers, armed with anti-tank grenades, threw themselves at the panzers, sacrificing themselves to stop them. In one account, a German commander describes a Soviet teenager throwing himself under his tank with an explosive. These tactics, combined with numerical superiority, made every battle a suicidal challenge for the crews. Soviet fighter bombers, such as the Il-2 Sturmovik, were another threat. Nicknamed the Black Terror by the Germans, the Il-2 attacked with rockets and 23mm cannons, piercing the panzer's upper armor. In 1943, Il-2s destroyed 1,000 German tanks, with crews burned alive or torn apart by shrapnel. The crews, without adequate air cover, stared at the skies in dread. One gunner describes the sound of the Il-2s as a deathly whir, followed by explosions that shook the tank. The Luftwaffe, stretched to its limits, was unable to protect the Panzer divisions, leaving the men exposed. Soviet tactics evolved rapidly. In 1941, counterattacks were disorganized, but by 1942, the Soviets were using coordinated ambushes, luring panzers into traps. In Operation Uranus, Stalingrad, T-34s encircled the German Sixth Army, trapping 50 panzer divisions. The isolated crews would fight until they ran out of ammunition, knowing that surrender was not an option. The Soviets, learning from their defeats, used terrain, forests, hills, rivers, to ambush. In one report, a panzer commander describes the panic of seeing 20 T-34s emerging from a forest, his tank running out of fuel to flee. Soviet numerical superiority was overwhelming. In 1943, the Red Army had 5 million soldiers on the front lines, compared to 3 million Germans. For every panzer crew member, there were 10 Soviet soldiers. This disparity meant that German tanks, although tactically superior, were overwhelmed by waves of T-34s. At Prokhorovka in 1943, 800 Soviet tanks collided with 400 panzers, with the Germans losing 70% of their vehicles. Exhausted crews fought for days without rest, facing an enemy that seemed unrelenting. Morale plummeted at the sight of the endless tide of red steel. Soviet partisans added an invisible terror. Operating in forests and villages, they laid anti-tank mines that ripped through tracks, leaving tanks stranded. In Belarus in 1942, partisans destroyed 500 tanks with improvised explosives. The crews, forced to abandon their vehicles, were hunted by snipers. One driver describes the fear of hearing explosions at night, knowing that a mined road awaited. The partisans, supported by the local population, turned every route into a trap, eroding the crew's confidence in their safety. The physical strain on the crews was constant. Combating the T-34 required grueling precision, with gunners firing under pressure while loaders handled heavy shells. At Kursk, crews fired up to 50 shells per day, leaving their arms trembling and bodies exhausted. The heat and smoke inside the tank were suffocating, while the vibrations of combat caused chronic pain. A 1943 medical report describes crew members with back injuries from loading shells in tight spaces. The Soviet enemy, with its relentless pace, offered no respite, turning each battle into a test of endurance. Morale collapsed in the face of Soviet superiority. The crews, trained for blitzkrieg, were unprepared for a war of attrition. In Stalingrad, a gunner writes of the terror of seeing T-34s surrounding his position, knowing there was no escape. Nazi propaganda promised victory, but the reality was an enemy that replaced losses instantly. In 1943, Germany lost 6,000 tanks, while the Soviets produced 20,000. The crews, seeing their units decimated, lost hope, fighting for pride or survival rather than victory. Soviet ambushes were a deadly art. Using the terrain, T-34s hid in hills or forests, attacking when the panzers were exposed. At Kharkov in 1943, German crews were surprised by 200 T-34s hidden in a ravine, losing 100 tanks within hours. Commanders, dependent on limited sights, could not anticipate these traps. One account describes a Panzer surrounded by 5 T-34s, its crew firing until they exhausted their ammunition. These ambushes, executed with precision, made every advance a deadly risk. Soviet artillery was a constant threat. 122mm guns, deployed en masse, could destroy a Panzer at 2,000 meters. At Kursk, Soviet fields of fire decimated Panzer columns before they even saw the enemy. Crews, trapped in tanks under bombardment, suffered shock from nearby explosions. One gunner describes the terror of feeling the tank shake like a toy, with shrapnel bouncing inside. The artillery, combined with the T-34s, created a hell where the crews had nowhere to hide. Soviet snipers hunted crew members abandoning damaged tanks. At Stalingrad, men escaping from burning panzers were shot down as they climbed out of the hatches. A 1942 report estimates that 20% of panzer casualties were caused by snipers. The crews, aware of this, hesitated to abandon their tanks, even when they were burning. One driver describes how his wounded friend was shot down while trying to crawl into a trench. This constant terror turned every mission into a potential doom. Soviet air superiority grew over the years. In 1943, IL-2s dominated the skies, attacking panzers with precise rocket fire. The crews, without air cover, felt abandoned. In one account, a commander describes staring into the sky, knowing that an IL-2 could take out his tank in seconds. The outmatched Luftwaffe was unable to counter this threat. At Kursk, Soviet air raids destroyed 500 German tanks. The crews, trapped in their turrets, lived with the constant drone of enemy aircraft. The psychological impact of the Soviet enemy was devastating. Crews, seeing waves of T-34s, developed a visceral fear of being overrun. In one diary, a gunner describes hallucinations of tanks emerging from the fog. The pressure of fighting relentlessly against a seemingly endless enemy broke minds. By 1943, 15% of crews showed signs of mental collapse. Camaraderie, though strong, could not stem the tide. The men, facing a relentless enemy, fought with a sense of doom. Soviet logistics outstripped German ones. While Germany struggled with scarce supplies, the Soviets received fuel and spare parts from factories in the Urals. By 1943, the Red Army had 10,000 operational tanks, compared to 2,500 panzers. German crews, starved of fuel, abandoned serviceable tanks, becoming easy targets. One report describes a panzer division fighting with only 10 operational tanks in Kharkov. This disparity crushed the crews, who saw their efforts reduced to nothing by the Soviet tide. Soviet attrition tactics were relentless. At Stalingrad, T-34s attacked in waves, sacrificing tanks to exhaust the Germans. Panzer crews, without replacements, fought until they collapsed. In one account, a commander describes firing until they ran out of shells, surrounded by 30 T-34s. The Soviet strategy, based on numbers, turned every battle into a war of endurance that Germany could not win. The outnumbered crews fought with desperate courage. Soviet resistance was fueled by the homeland. Red Army soldiers, motivated by the defense of their land, fought to the death. At Kursk, T-34s advanced even under fire, with crews sacrificing themselves to destroy panzers. This tenacity contrasted with German fatigue, with crews exhausted after years of war. A 1943 report describes a T-34 ramming a Panzer, destroying itself to stop the enemy. The German crews, facing this determination, felt overwhelmed by an enemy that would not surrender. The impact of the Soviet enemy was total. In 1943, Germany lost 6,000 tanks, with 20,000 crew members killed or captured. The T-34s, IL-2s, and artillery created a front that the Panzers could not win. The crews, caught in this storm, fought with a courage that their numerical superiority could not overcome. Their stories, preserved in diaries, show a pride roto for defeat. This chapter honors their struggle against an enemy that crushed them with steel and will. Chapter 4. The Psychological Price of Mechanized Warfare. Mechanized warfare on the Eastern Front was an assault on the mind as much as the body. Panzer crews, trapped in tanks under constant fire, faced psyche-shattering stress. The fear of being burned alive, known as tank fever, haunted the men, with 15% experiencing mental breakdowns in 1943. The noise, claustrophobia, and the threat of T-34s, artillery, and mines created an endless cycle of terror. At Stalingrad, crews fought for days without sleep, hallucinating from fatigue. Letters, found in archives, describe nightmares of burning tanks and screaming comrades. The war, with its relentless pace, turned men into shadows, battling not only the enemy but their own inner demons. The isolation inside the tank amplified the stress. Narrow sights offered limited vision, leaving crews blind to the enemy. At Kursk, one commander describes the panic of not knowing if a T-34 was 50 meters away. The lack of communication, with radios failing, isolated the tanks, turning them into islands of fear. The men, enclosed in 3 cubic meters, felt claustrophobic like a claw. One gunner recounts hallucinations of walls closing in on him after hours of combat. This isolation, combined with the constant danger, eroded sanity, leaving men on the verge of collapse. The fear of burns was universal. A hit from a T-34 could set a Panzer ablaze in seconds, trapping the crew. In 1943, 70% of Panzer casualties were from fires, with men burned alive or maimed by shrapnel. Survivors, horrendously scarred, faced trauma that haunted them for life. One medical report describes a driver screaming every night, reliving the moment his tank burned. Tank fever wasn't just fear, it was a visceral terror that paralyzed men before every mission. This constant fear turned every shot into an existential threat. Fatigue was an invisible enemy. Crews fought 20 hours a day, repairing tanks, driving under fire, and loading heavy shells. At Stalingrad, one loader describes fainting after loading 50 shells in a day. Sleep deprivation, with only 2 to 3 hours per night, caused hallucinations and fatal errors. In one account, a driver crashed his Panzer into a tree, unable to stay awake. Data shows that 10% of Panzer accidents in 1942 were due to fatigue. Crews, stretched to their limits, operated like automatons, their humanity eroded by exhaustion. The pressure of orders was relentless. Commanders in Berlin demanded impossible advances, ignoring attrition. In 1942, the 4th Panzer Division was ordered to advance 100 kilometers without fuel, leaving crews stranded under fire. Under pressure, officers shouted at their men, eroding morale. One diary describes a commander weeping after ordering a suicidal attack. The crews, caught between obedience and survival, felt the war was a trap. This pressure, combined with the danger, turned every mission into a test of will. The loss of comrades was devastating. Crews, united as families, suffered each death as a personal blow. At Kursk, a gunner describes burying his loader, his best friend, after an explosion. The camaraderie, vital to enduring the front, was fractured with each loss. Men watching tanks burn knew they could be next. In one report, 20% of crews showed signs of depression after losing comrades. This accumulated grief turned survivors into ghosts, fighting for those who were no longer with them. The constant noise was a mental assault. The Panzer IV's engine, roaring at 3,000 RPM, and the thunder of the 75mm cannon left ears ringing. Men developed partial deafness, with 30% affected in 1943. One radio operator describes the silence after a fight as deafening, his mind unable to process the stillness. The intercoms, often broken, forced out screams that exhausted the voice. This noise, combined with external explosions, created an aural chaos that haunted the men in their dreams, an echo of the war that never ceased. The feeling of being hunted was constant. Soviet T-34s, IL-2s, and snipers lurked around every hill and forest. In Kharkov, 1943, crews described the terror of waiting for a hit, not knowing where it would come from. Paranoia took hold, with men hallucinating enemies in the fog. One commander recounts shooting at shadows, fearing an ambush. This unrelieved tension caused nervous breakdowns, with 10% of crews evacuated for mental problems in 1943. Mechanized warfare turned men into prey to their own fear. The lack of rest was a vicious cycle. Missions, often at night, prevented sleep. At Stalingrad, crews fought for 72 hours straight, collapsing in their seats. One driver describes falling asleep at the wheel, dreaming of his home in Bavaria. The lack of sleep caused errors, a gunner aiming poorly, a driver crashing. In one report, 15% of Panzer losses in 1942 were due to human error related to fatigue. Crews, deprived of respite, crumbled, their minds unable to keep up. Nazi propaganda compounded the trauma. Promising quick victories, it clashed with the reality of constant defeat. In 1942, a gunner wrote of his rage at reading invincibility leaflets as his unit was decimated. The disconnect between Berlin and the front eroded confidence. The men, feeling abandoned, fought for pride, not for Hitler. This disillusionment, combined with stress, created an emotional void. A 1943 psychological report describes crew members with combat apathy, unable to feel anything beyond fear. Camaraderie was a fragile shield. The men shared stories and cigarettes, trying to forget the terror. In one account, a crew sang carols at Christmas 1941, inside a frozen Panzer. But each loss, a burned driver, a mangled gunner, broke this bond. Survivors carried the guilt, wondering why they were still alive. At Stalingrad, a commander describes the silence of his crew after losing 2 men, their broken brotherhood. This camaraderie, though vital, could not stave off the mental collapse. Social isolation was profound. Unlike the infantry, Panzer crews lived in their tanks, away from other units. This loneliness, combined with the danger, amplified the stress. In one diary, a radio operator describes writing letters to his mother, knowing she would never send them. The lack of contact with the outside world turned the tanks into psychological prisons. The men, with no news from home, clung to photos and mementos, but these faded under the weight of combat. Mechanized warfare isolated them from the world and from themselves. The impact of physical wounds compounded the trauma. Burns, common in 50% of casualties, left scars that reminded the men of their vulnerability. One medical report describes a crew member with a disfigured face, unable to look himself in a mirror. Shrapnel wounds, affecting 40% of casualties, caused chronic pain. Survivors, evacuated to field hospitals, faced precarious conditions with infections killing many. This physical suffering, combined with stress, created a cycle of pain that haunted the men long after the battle. The pressure of responsibility was overwhelming. Commanders, responsible for their crews, bore the brunt of every decision. At Kursk, one commander describes the guilt of ordering an advance that killed his crew. Gunners, knowing that one errant shot could doom them all, operated under extreme stress. One loader recounts the fear of not loading a shell in time, knowing that a second one could be fatal. This responsibility, combined with the danger, made each mission an unbearable mental burden. Mental collapse was common. In 1943, 15% of Panzer crews were evacuated for combat fatigue, now known as post-traumatic stress disorder. The men hallucinated T-34s at night or refused to enter their tanks for fear of fire. One report describes a gunner who shot himself after seeing his crew burning. These collapses, stigmatized by officers, were a cry for humanity in an inhuman world. The crews, pushed to their limits, fought against their own minds as much as against the enemy. The lack of medical support was a tragedy. Overwhelmed field hospitals were unable to treat mental disorders. In 1942, only 5% of evacuations were for psychological problems, not due to a lack of cases, but due to negligence. Men sent back to the front often collapsed under the pressure. One driver describes being forced into combat after collapsing, only to collapse in his tank. This lack of care turned crew members into victims of a system that viewed them as disposable parts. Soviet propaganda fueled fear. Leaflets dropped from planes promised death to the fascist invaders, reminding crews of their vulnerability. At Stalingrad, Soviet loudspeakers blared messages of surrender, eroding morale. One gunner describes the terror of hearing "your death is near" while repairing his tank. This psychological warfare, combined with combat, created an atmosphere of hopelessness. Crews, feeling the weight of defeat, fought with a sense of doom. The long-term impact was devastating. Survivors, returning to Germany, faced nightmares and alienation. One Kursk veteran describes being unable to sleep without hearing explosions. The trauma, ignored by Nazi society, left the men isolated. In a post-war study, 30% of Panzer crew members showed signs of post-traumatic stress. Their stories, preserved in memoirs, show a pride shattered by defeat. Mechanized warfare didn't just kill bodies, it destroyed souls, leaving invisible scars. Camaraderie offered solace, but not salvation. The men shared laughter and memories in the tanks, trying to forget their fear. In one story, a crewman plays cards during a lull, having one last laugh before an ambush. But each loss, a burned brother, a shattered friend, broke this brotherhood. Survivors carried the guilt, wondering why they lived. This camaraderie, though strong, was a fragile shield against the psychological toll of war. The legacy of these crews is their mental resilience. Despite the terror, they operated their tanks, facing an overwhelming enemy. In 1943, the Panzer divisions lost 20,000 men, many to mental breakdowns or suicide. Their stories, in diaries and letters, show a courage that defied madness. This chapter honors their struggle, trapped in a mechanized hell where the mind was as vulnerable as the body, on an unforgiving front. Chapter 5. The Fate of the Defeated. When a German tank was destroyed on the Eastern Front, the fate of its crew was almost always fatal. A hit from AT-34 or a mine could set a Panzer ablaze in seconds, killing 70% of the occupants by burns or shrapnel. At Kursk in 1943, 400 tanks were destroyed in one day, with thousands of crew members incinerated or mangled. The narrow, heavy hatches trapped men in the fire, turning the tank into a burning coffin. Survivors, if they managed to escape, faced snipers or summary execution by enraged Soviet soldiers. At Stalingrad, 90% of the crews of the 6th Panzer Division were killed or captured. This chapter explores the fate of the defeated, an end of unimaginable suffering for men who fought to their last breath. Death in a tank was swift and brutal. An armor-piercing shell, like the T-34's 76mm, could punch through armor, igniting fuel or ammunition. In an instant, the interior became an inferno, with temperatures reaching 1,000 degrees Celsius. A 1943 medical report describes bodies charred beyond recognition inside destroyed tanks. Burns, affecting 50% of casualties, were agonizing, with infections killing many survivors. One gunner recounts the horror of watching his loader burn, trapped in a jammed hatch. Death wasn't just a possibility, it was a certainty for most, a violent end on a merciless front. Survivors faced an equally cruel fate. Abandoning a burning tank meant exposing themselves to Soviet snipers, who targeted the escaping crew members. At Stalingrad, 20% of Panzer casualties were from gunfire after exiting destroyed tanks. The wounded and disoriented men, crawling in the snow, were easy prey. One driver describes seeing his commander cut down as he tried to surrender. Soviet fury, fueled by years of invasion, offered no mercy. The crew members, aware of this, often preferred to die in their tanks rather than face capture. Soviet captivity was its own hell. Of the 91,000 Germans captured at Stalingrad, only 5,000 returned alive. Gulags, like Vorkuta, were forced labor camps where hunger and cold killed 60% of the prisoners. Panzer crews, considered elite, were treated harshly, seen as symbols of the Nazi invader. In one account, a radio operator describes marching 50 kilometers in -30 degrees Celsius -22 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures, with torn boots and no food. The rations, often watery soup, did not sustain the men, who died of malnutrition. Captivity was not salvation, it was a slow sentence. Torture was common during interrogations. The Soviet NKVD, seeking information on Panzer tactics, used brutal methods: beatings, sleep deprivation, exposure to cold. One post-war report describes a Panzer commander with mangled hands after interrogation. Crewmen, trained for resilience, often collapsed under the pressure. In Kharkov in 1943, prisoners were executed if they did not talk, with 10% of those captured dying during interrogation. This treatment, combined with the trauma of defeat, left the men broken, their spirits crushed by a system that saw them as absolute enemies. Hunger in the gulags was relentless. The rations, 500 to 800 calories a day, did not sustain the men who worked 12 hours a day in mines or on railroads. In one diary, a crew member describes eating grass to survive, his body reduced to skin and bones. Malnutrition killed 40% of the prisoners in 1943. Diseases, such as typhus, ran rampant in the overcrowded barracks, lacking medical care. Data show that 50% of Panzer prisoners died in the first 2 years of captivity. Hunger, more than bullets, was the final executioner of the defeated. The cold in the gulags was as deadly as at the front. In Siberia, temperatures dropped to -50 degrees Celsius, and prisoners, without adequate clothing, suffered massive frostbite. One account describes a gunner losing his toes after working in the snow. The poorly constructed barracks offered little shelter, with wind seeping through the cracks. In Vorkuta, 30% of deaths were due to hypothermia. The crew members, accustomed to the cold of their tanks, were unprepared for this prolonged torture. The Russian winter, which defeated them at the front, haunted them in captivity. Hopelessness dominated the prisoners. Separated from their units, the men lost the camaraderie that sustained them on the front lines. In a gulag, one commander describes the loneliness of not knowing if his family was alive. Letters, if they arrived, were censored, and news of German defeats eroded hope. Suicide, though rare, occurred, with men hanging themselves in barracks to escape the suffering. A 1944 report estimated that 5% of Panzer prisoners took their own lives. Defeat, combined with captivity, turned the men into shadows of their former selves. Soviet propaganda was a psychological weapon. Prisoners were forced to listen to speeches about communist superiority, while leaflets promised freedom for betraying Germany. A radio operator recounts his comrades' contempt for these attempts, but the pressure sapped morale. Some, broken, collaborated, but were executed upon returning to Germany. This psychological warfare, combined with hunger and cold, destroyed willpower. The crew members, proud at the front, became ghosts in captivity, their identity eroded by defeat. Forced labor was a daily torture. In the gulags, prisoners built railroads or mined coal, working until they collapsed. One driver describes digging in frozen ground, his hands bleeding from the effort. Impossible quotas, imposed by brutal guards, punished the weak with beatings. In 1943, 20% of prisoners died of exhaustion. The Panzer crews, trained for mechanized warfare, were ill-equipped for this slave labor. The Gulag, more than a camp, was a machine for destroying men. Camaraderie, though broken, offered solace. In the Gulags, crew members formed small groups, sharing rations and souvenirs to survive. One account describes a gunner giving his bread to a dying comrade. But constant death, from hunger, cold, disease, eroded these bonds. The men, watching their friends perish, carried overwhelming guilt. In one diary, a commander writes of his helplessness as he watched his crew die one by one. This brotherhood, though strong, could not stem the tragedy of captivity. The physical impact was devastating. Burns and wounds from tanks left survivors mutilated, unable to work in the gulags. One medical report describes a crew member with 60% of his body burned, dying from untreated infections. Amputations due to frostbite were common, with 15% of prisoners losing limbs. Malnutrition turned men into skeletons with an average weight of 40 kilos. This physical suffering, combined with trauma, left survivors unrecognizable, their humanity robbed by captivity. The fate of those captured was a cycle of cruelty. Of the 3 million German prisoners in the USSR, only 40% returned. Panzer crews, viewed as elite, faced harsher treatment. At Vorkuta, 70% of the Panzer prisoners died before 1945. Survivors, freed in the 1950s, returned with broken bodies and minds. One veteran describes being unable to speak about his captivity, haunted by memories of the gulags. This fate, worse than death in combat, was a prolonged sentence of suffering. Summary execution was a constant threat. In Kharkov in 1943, the Soviets executed 1,000 Panzer prisoners after an offensive. The crews, aware of this, fought to the bitter end, preferring to die in their tanks. One account describes a crew firing until they exhausted their ammunition, knowing that surrender meant a shot in the back of the head. This brutality, fueled by Soviet vengeance, turned capture into a slow or immediate death. The crews, trapped in this cycle, had no escape. The loss of identity was profound. In the gulags, men were reduced to numbers, stripped of their Panzer pride. One commander describes forgetting his name after years of captivity, his pre-war life erased. Soviet propaganda, forcing them to renounce their loyalty, eroded their sense of self. Survivors, returning to Germany, faced rejection as traitors. In one post-war study, 20% of former prisoners displayed social alienation. Captivity didn't just kill bodies, it destroyed souls. The psychological impact was lasting. Survivors suffered nightmares of burning tanks and freezing gulags. One Stalingrad veteran describes waking up screaming, reliving his capture. Post-traumatic stress, ignored by Nazi Germany, left the men isolated. By the 1950s, 30% of former Panzer prisoners showed signs of severe trauma. Their stories, preserved in memoirs, reveal a pain that never healed. Captivity, more than combat, scarred the men for life. The crew's resistance was heroic. Despite the defeat, some organized escapes, though few were successful. In Vorkuta, a group of crew members attempted to flee, only to be recaptured and executed. One account describes a radio operator hiding a knife for months, planning an escape that never happened. This resistance, however futile, demonstrated their spirit. The crews, even in the gulags, clung to hope even if it was a glimmer in the darkness. Camaraderie in captivity was a fragile consolation. Men shared stories from their tanks, recalling days of glory to forget their hunger. In a gulag, a gunner describes singing Bavarian songs with his comrades, defying the guards. But constant death, from disease, hunger, cold, broke these bonds. Survivors carried the guilt of living while others perished. This brotherhood, however strong, could not stem the tragedy of captivity. The legacy of the defeated is their sacrifice. The Panzer crews, decimated at the front or in gulags, paid the price for Nazi ambition. In 1943, 20,000 crew members died in combat, and another 10,000 in captivity. Their stories, in diaries and accounts, show a courage that defied defeat. This chapter honors their suffering, caught in a fate of fire or ice, on a front that offered no mercy. The cost of defeat for German tank crews. World War II on the Eastern Front was a hellish, consuming German tank crews, caught in a conflict that pitted them not only against the Soviet enemy but also against a brutal environment and their own machines. From the launch of Operation Barbarossa in 1941 until the fall of Berlin in 1945, the Panzer divisions, symbols of the Blitzkrieg, suffered devastating losses. more than 20,000 tanks destroyed and nearly 100,000 crew members killed or captured. This book explores their odyssey through the Russian winter, the claustrophobia of their tanks, the superiority of the Soviet enemy, the psychological collapse, and the cruel fate of the defeated. Each chapter reveals an aspect of the suffering that turned these men, many barely over 20, into victims of an impossible war. Their stories, drawn from diaries, letters, and archives, are a testament to courage and tragedy, a reminder of the human cost of Nazi ambition. The Russian winter, described in the first chapter, was as lethal an adversary as the Red Army. Temperatures of -40°C froze engines and men, leaving Panzer crews stranded in a white, unforgiving landscape. Tanks, designed for European roads, became bogged down in mud and snow, while frostbite and hunger claimed thousands of lives. In 1941–42, 30% of German casualties were from weather, not combat. The crews, without adequate clothing or supplies, faced a natural enemy that would not negotiate. Their accounts, written on freezing nights, speak of pride shattered by helplessness, of men struggling to stay alive before facing the enemy. Winter didn't just halt the invasion, it marked the crews with a suffering that transcended the war. Inside the tanks, the second chapter depicted a world of claustrophobia and danger. The Panzer III, IV, and Tiger were steel coffins where 5 men lived cramped together, enduring scorching heat in the summer and deadly cold in the winter. The deafening noise, suffocating smoke, and constant risk of fire turned every mission into torture. At Kursk in 1943, 70% of Panzer casualties were from burns or internal shrapnel, with men trapped in cramped hatches. The crews, exhausted from endless repairs and fighting, lived in fear of being burned alive. Their diaries describe a mechanical hell, where the tank, their weapon, was also their prison, a space that consumed them physically and mentally. The third chapter highlighted the overwhelming superiority of the Soviet enemy. The T-34s, with their sloped armor and 76mm guns, outnumbered the Panzers in number and design, while Soviet production flooded the front with 80,000 tanks. At Prokhorovka in 1943, German crews faced waves of T-34s, losing 400 tanks in one day. 2 Sturmovix and Soviet artillery amplified the terror, hunting Panzers from the air and the ground. Outnumbered 5-1, the crews fought against an enemy that replaced losses instantly. Their accounts, filled with panic and admiration for the T-34s, depict an unequal struggle where courage was not enough against the tide of red steel. The psychological toll, explored in the fourth chapter, was a mind-breaking burden. Tank fever, the fear of being burned alive, affected 15% of crews, with men hallucinating T-34s at night. Fatigue, after days without sleep, caused fatal errors, while the pressure of impossible orders eroded morale. At Stalingrad, crews fought for 72 hours straight, collapsing under the stress. Letters home, stained with oil and blood, reveal nightmares of fire and lost comrades. Mechanized warfare, with its noise and claustrophobia, turned men into shadows, fighting their own demons as much as the enemy. This trauma, ignored by the Wehrmacht, left scars that lasted for decades. The fate of the defeated in the fifth chapter was the culmination of their suffering. When a tank was destroyed, 70% of the crews died in the fire or from shrapnel. Survivors faced snipers or summary executions, and those captured suffered in gulags where 60% perished from hunger and exposure. In Stalingrad, of 91,000 prisoners, only 5,000 returned. The crew members, treated harshly for being elite, faced brutal interrogations and forced labor in Siberia. Their stories, preserved in memoirs, speak of a struggle to maintain humanity in a captivity that was a slow death. The Gulag, more than the front, was the final destination of the defeated, a hell that stole body and soul. These chapters reveal a common thread, the sacrifice of men caught in a war beyond them. The Panzer crews, trained for swift victory, faced a front where the weather, the enemy, and their own machines conspired against them. Of the 100,000 crew members sent east, 60 to 70% never returned, either due to death in combat or captivity. Their diaries and letters, found in archives, show a pride mixed with despair, a desire to return home that was rarely fulfilled. The camaraderie forged in tanks and trenches was their only solace, but it could not stem the tragedy. These men, young and full of dreams, paid the price for Nazi arrogance, their sacrifice forgotten on the margins of history. The impact of the Eastern Front transcended the war. Panzer losses weakened the Wehrmacht, marking the turning point in 1943 with defeats at Kursk and Stalingrad. The crews, though fighting for a doomed regime, displayed a resilience that defies understanding. Their stories, beyond ideology, are a testament to humanity under extreme pressure. The Russian winter, T-34s, confinement in tanks, and captivity didn't just destroy bodies. They shaped a legacy of suffering that still resonates. This book honors their struggle, not as heroes of a lost cause, but as men who faced the impossible with a courage that transcends defeat. The cost of defeat was more than statistical, it was profoundly human. The crews, their faces blackened by smoke, wrote letters to families they would never see again. Their photos, tucked into backpacks, display smiles that belie the horror they experienced. In 1943, Germany lost 6,000 tanks and 20,000 crew members in a single year, numbers that hide stories of loss and resilience. The survivors, returning to a shattered Germany, bore physical and mental scars, haunted by nightmares of fire and ice. Their suffering, ignored by a society in ruins, is a reminder that war does not end with surrender, but lives on in those who endured it. As we close this book, we pay tribute to the Panzer crews whose names lie in Russian fields, forgotten gulags, or letters never sent. Their struggle on the Eastern Front, against winter, T-34s, their own tanks, and the weight of defeat, is a dark chapter of World War II. They did not seek glory, only survival, and their sacrifice paved the way for Allied victory, albeit at a cost few can imagine. May their stories, preserved in these pages, serve as a beacon, reminding us of the price of war and the strength of the human spirit in the face of adversity.